When Mitt Romney, a name etched into the marble of Republican tradition, said he agreed with Jasmine Crockett, the chamber didn't just quiet down. It froze. The air changed. Every head turned, every phone lifted, every whisper died in midair. For a split second, Washington, that cynical theater of ego and noise, forgot its lines. Reporters blinked at each other, unsure if they'd heard right. Was this the same Romney who'd once been the symbol of party discipline? Now nodding toward a Democrat who'd been labeled everything from too loud to too bold? Even Crockett herself looked momentarily still, her expression unreadable, half shock, half composure carved from years of being underestimated. Cameras zoomed in. Aides exchanged looks. Across the aisle, familiar smirks disappeared. The silence wasn't empty, it was charged, alive, the kind that precedes history. Romney didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. He simply said what needed saying, that her proposal wasn't partisan noise, it was principled sense. And in that moment, something fragile yet electric sparked in the chamber: respect. Real, uncalculated, inconvenient respect. You could feel the tremor ripple outward, from polished floors to trending feeds. The establishment didn't know whether to clap or panic. The pundits who thrive on chaos suddenly found themselves out of script. Because no one saw it coming. Not the media. Not his party. Not even the people who'd stopped believing Washington could still surprise them. But it did. And that single nod, small, measured, human, cracked something deeper than party lines. It cracked the myth that decency was extinct. But to understand why this one gesture hit like an earthquake, we have to go back to the battles that made it possible. It started weeks before the gasp heard around Washington, with Jasmine Crockett standing at the podium, surrounded by a wall of indifference. She wasn't selling sound bites. She was fighting for something most in that chamber pretended to understand but few dared to touch: accountability. Her proposal, a Justice and Transparency Reform Act, wasn't written to please the pundits or win headlines. It was written for the people who never get invited into the room where the rules are bent. The bill demanded full disclosure of lobbying ties, limits on post offices' profit pipelines, and real-time public access to congressional financial dealings. Simple, moral, impossible. Within hours of its unveiling, the usual chorus began. Too naive, too idealistic, too ambitious for a freshman. They laughed like they'd seen this movie before, another new face with big talk and no idea how the system protects itself. The headlines followed suit. Crockett overreaches in bold new proposal. A rookie's lesson in political reality. They called it theatrical. They called her reckless. What they refused to call it was right. Yet she kept her composure. She didn't yell back. She didn't retreat. She leaned in harder, turning every mockery into momentum. For her, this wasn't a headline war. It was a moral line in the sand. In every committee hearing, every interview, she repeated one phrase that started to echo beyond party walls: if you can't serve without secrecy, you shouldn't serve at all. It wasn't politics. It was principle. And for that, Washington tried to bury her under labels. But something strange began to happen. Outside the Capitol bubble, ordinary people started listening. Activists, students, even disillusioned moderates began quoting her lines, stitching her speeches into TikToks, making hashtags out of her defiance. The establishment rolled its eyes, but the public leaned in. They saw what the insiders couldn't: a woman unbought, unbothered, and unafraid. Still, inside that marble arena, the chill was real. Every time she spoke, the air thickened with quiet hostility. Eyes rolled. Conversations shifted. The power brokers didn't fear her bill, they feared her conviction, because conviction in Washington is contagious. So when Mitt Romney's voice cut through that air weeks later, it didn't land on nothing. It landed on tension that had been building brick by brick. It landed on a wall that Jasmine Crockett had been pushing against since the day she took her seat. His words didn't just validate a policy. They validated the struggle behind it, the right of a newcomer, a black woman, a truth teller, to demand honesty in a place built on compromise. And that's why the chamber froze. It wasn't shock at Romney's courage. It was disbelief that someone like her had finally been heard. But the irony is, the man who would soon defend her once stood as a symbol of everything she fought against. Before that moment of respect, Washington had already decided who Jasmine Crockett was. Too loud, too emotional, not seasoned enough. The same tired script recycled for every woman who refused to shrink to fit the room. Each time she spoke, someone interrupted. Each time she questioned authority, laughter followed, the kind that hides fear behind smugness. In one committee hearing, she asked for evidence before a rushed vote. A senior member chuckled. "Settle down, young lady." The room laughed, until Crockett calmly replied, "Then maybe act like grown men." The laughter died. The clip went viral. And from that day, they stopped underestimating her and started resenting her. The real antagonist wasn't one man. It was the culture, a machine that feeds on arrogance, rewards obedience, and fears authenticity. A culture that treats confidence from a woman of color as aggression and silence as virtue. It wasn't built for voices like hers. It was built to outlast them. And somewhere on the other side of that chamber sat Mitt Romney, the quiet custodian of tradition. Polished, principled, predictable. He condemned chaos but rarely confronted it. For years he'd been the symbol of the system's civility, calm on the surface, complicit underneath. He'd seen the rise of cruelty masquerading as leadership, yet said little. Maybe too little. But lately, even he had begun to see the cracks. The shouting. The hypocrisy. The emptiness of the party lines he'd once defended. He was watching the house he helped build rot from within. Crockett and Romney, opposites in every way, were staring at the same truth. Washington had become allergic to honesty, and that truth was about to collide with both of them. Because the moment he would later stand up for her didn't begin with respect. It began with exhaustion. His, hers, ours. But what no one realized was that Romney, too, had grown tired of the noise, and the next chapter of his legacy was about to begin. Long before Washington learned her name, Jasmine Crockett was already fighting uphill. In Texas courtrooms, she stood beside people who couldn't afford a lawyer, defending the forgotten against a system that never expected her to win. She walked into rooms where she didn't belong, spoke truths no one wanted to hear, and built a reputation for turning chaos into order, not with volume, but with precision. She wasn't born into privilege or legacy. Her education was hard-earned, her path carved through rejection and resilience. When other lawyers avoided unpopular cases, she took them. When judges rolled their eyes, she stayed steady. Her clients weren't powerful. They were poor, brown, silenced. She fought for them anyway. And that fight shaped her voice long before it echoed through Congress. By the time she entered politics, her armor was already forged, but Washington tested it in new ways. The insults were subtle at first, too emotional, too direct, not polished enough. Then came the headlines that twisted her words, the online mobs that flooded her feeds. She learned quickly that confidence, when worn by a black woman, gets labeled arrogance. And still, she didn't bend. In one hearing, after being interrupted 3 times in 30 seconds, she leaned forward and said evenly, "I'll wait until you're done pretending I'm not here." The clip went viral. Not because she shouted, but because she refused to disappear. Behind the calm expression, you could see the years of endurance, the exhaustion turned into fuel. Every moment like that added to her myth, not the one the media wrote, but the one people built for themselves, watching her stand her ground. Students quoted her in speeches. Mothers showed their daughters her clips. Even critics began to admit quietly that she didn't just debate, she dismantled. The cost was heavy. Threats in her inbox. Lies on air. Smirks in committee rooms. But every time they tried to rattle her, she met them with poise. She wasn't performing. She was surviving, and reminding the powerful what accountability looks like when it refuses to blink. So when Romney's voice eventually broke the silence, it wasn't random. It wasn't charity. It was recognition, the kind that can't be faked or forced. The kind that only comes when truth finally cuts through the noise. Because Jasmine Crockett had earned that moment the hard way, by showing the world that composure can be louder than rage, and that integrity, no matter how inconvenient, still has an audience. So when the Senate floor turned hostile, Crockett didn't flinch, and Romney noticed. The chamber was already restless before Jasmine Crockett began speaking. Papers shuffled, murmurs filled the air, the kind of noise meant to drown out conviction. She stood at her desk, hands steady, gaze locked forward. Across from her, a senior representative leaned back, smirking as if the outcome was predetermined. Her bill, the Justice and Transparency Reform Act, had reached its breaking point. Weeks of pushback, endless amendments designed to gut it, and headlines mocking her persistence had led to this hearing. She knew the script. They'd interrupt, misquote, twist. But Crockett didn't come to play along. "The American people deserve honesty from those who serve them," she said. "That's not radical. That's the job." A voice cut across the room, sharp, mocking. "Spare us the moral lectures, Congresswoman. We're not in church." Laughter flickered from a few corners. Another added, "Maybe she should focus on understanding the budget before lecturing veterans of this chamber." She waited. Silence is power when used by the right person. Then, calmly, with respect, "Maybe if more of you understood accountability, we wouldn't need this bill." The laughter stopped. The tension didn't. They tried to derail her with procedural jargon, feigned confusion, with tone policing disguised as decorum. But Crockett refused to mirror their chaos. Her voice didn't rise. It sharpened. Every question they threw became an opening she filled with facts, data, and composure. Meanwhile, Romney sat at the far end of the table, motionless. To most, he looked detached. But his eyes told another story. The quiet study of someone witnessing a battle he'd fought once and lost to cynicism. One senator tried a final jab. "Congresswoman, you're suggesting reforms that question the integrity of this institution. Do you realize the implication?" Her reply landed like a gavel. If integrity has to be protected from questions, then it isn't integrity. The words hung in the air, raw and unpolished, impossible to spin. Cameras clicked. Staffers froze. Even those who disagreed couldn't find their footing. Crockett stood alone but unmoved. She had no allies in that moment, only truth, and that was enough to make the room nervous. Every attempt to corner her ended in self-exposure. Every insult made her argument stronger. The more they spoke over her, clearer she became. And as she spoke, Romney leaned forward just slightly. His expression unreadable, his fingers pressed together. Those near him noticed, but no one dared comment. For the first time that day, the noise began to fade. The interruptions slowed. The mockery turned into murmurs, and the murmurs into silence. Crockett closed her binder, not as a signal of surrender, but as a quiet declaration. "I've said what needed to be said." All eyes turned to Romney, the elder statesman of composure, the one who rarely broke ranks. He hadn't moved, not yet. But something had shifted. A calculation, a decision, maybe even a memory of who he once was. The air thickened again, charged with the weight of an unscripted moment. Crockett met his gaze for just an instant, not seeking approval, but daring acknowledgement. And then it happened. A pause, a nod, and 5 words that no one saw coming. The air was static, the kind that hums before thunder. Crockett's words still echoed in the chamber when Mitt Romney finally shifted in his seat. One quiet movement, yet every head turned. Cameras angled. The room, moments ago full of murmurs, now waited for him. He cleared his throat. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, voice calm, but cutting through the tension. "What you've presented here, it isn't radical. It's constitutional." The room froze. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Romney went on, deliberate, unhurried. "In all my years here, I've watched too many debates collapse into theater. But this," he gestured toward Crockett, "is what the framers intended. Accountability, integrity, logic over noise, gasps, scribbles of pens, aides leaning toward one another whispering." He continued, "We can disagree on policy, but truth isn't partisan. And I'll say it plainly, her argument is one of the rare moments of intellectual honesty I've seen in this chamber." Boom, the shock was seismic. On one side, Democrats stared, unsure if they should applaud or just absorb what they'd heard. On the other, Republicans sat stunned, like the floor had tilted beneath them. A reporter's voice whispered from the gallery, "Did Romney just back Crockett?" He wasn't done. "There comes a time when defending principle means stepping past comfort," he said, his tone softening. "And if that time is now, then let history note it began with someone brave enough to speak without fear." Crockett didn't smile. She simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that the moment wasn't about her ego, but about the truth finally finding air. Flashbulbs popped. Someone clapped, hesitant, then joined by another. The chamber, once divided by habit, felt suspended in something rare: respect. Romney's words weren't loud, but they landed. Years of political rivalry, of partisan armor, cracked in that instant. It wasn't surrender, it was recognition. The camera caught Crockett lowering her gaze, composed, humble, unshaken. It was the image of grace meeting validation. The storm she had endured for months now seemed too quiet around her. Cut to reaction shots, aides wide-eyed, analysts already typing feverishly. One commentator mouthed to another, "This just changed everything." And in that silence, something symbolic unfolded, the soundless image of a glass ceiling cracking. Not in one clean break, but in 1,000 glittering fractures. The old guard looked rattled. The young members watched in awe. A few even smiled, sensing history. Romney gathered his papers as if unaware he'd just detonated a political earthquake. But before he sat, he added one last line. It's not weakness to respect strength when you see it. Even across the aisle. That was it. The mic drop. The sound of the gavel couldn't mask the murmurs rippling through the hall. Reporters rushed out, phones already lit with headlines. Romney backs Crockett. Bipartisan shock in Washington. Crockett exhaled slow and steady. No celebration, no triumph, just the quiet dignity of someone who had fought so long to be heard and finally was. Across the chamber, Romney gave a small nod. Not political, but human. Two leaders, worlds apart, connected in a rare moment of shared truth. For a brief cinematic instant, Washington didn't look divided. It looked awake, but the reaction outside that chamber was something neither of them expected. Within minutes, the clip hit the internet like lightning. Hashtag Romney Crockett moment trended across every platform. Hashtag respect across aisles followed within the hour. In an age addicted to outrage, this was something different. Unexpected, genuine, impossible to spin. A tweet from a political analyst went viral. I've covered DC for 20 years. I've never seen silence this loud. Romney didn't switch sides. He switched tone. And Crockett met him there. Cable news erupted. Screens split between stunned anchors and scrolling tweets. One host whispered, half in awe, was that bipartisanship? Another countered, no. That was what truth sounds like when someone finally listens. Clips flooded. TikTok. Young voters stitched Crockett's calm expression with captions like unbothered, unbreakable, unmatched. Edits turned Romney's nod into slow motion with orchestral music swelling beneath it. Someone looped the 5 words, "It's constitutional, not radical," into a remix that topped 1 million views overnight. Late-night comedians couldn't resist. In other news, one joked, Mitt Romney did the impossible. He agreed with a Democrat, and the internet didn't crash. Well, almost. But beyond the humor, something rare lingered. A glimmer of hope. Commentators across the spectrum admitted it. For one fleeting moment, Washington remembered what respect sounded like. Some conservatives called Romney a traitor. Some progressives called him redeemed. Most Americans just called it refreshing. Fan art appeared within hours. Digital paintings of Crockett and Romney standing under the Capitol dome. The cracks of light between them forming the words "Truth wins." A mother tweeted, "My daughter asked me why everyone looked shocked. I told her, because grown-ups forgot how to listen." News shows replayed the footage on loop. Each network spinning it differently, but the visuals told their own story. Her composure, his sincerity, the chamber's stunned silence. Even foreign outlets picked it up. A rare moment of American civility goes viral. Inside Congress, whispers spread. Some mocked, others reflected. But outside, something had shifted. Not politically, but emotionally. People were tired of the yelling, the insults, the performance. For one day, the algorithm rewarded grace. The cynics said it wouldn't last. Maybe they were right. But for millions watching on cracked phone screens and crowded commutes, it felt like proof that decency still had a pulse. Because beneath all the chaos, all the headlines and hashtags, one quiet message began to rise. Not about left or right, but about what happens when truth finally earns the room's respect. And beneath all the noise, one message began to rise above the chaos. Respect. A word Washington had forgotten until that day. In a city addicted to shouting matches and sound bites, the simple act of listening landed like a revolution. Crockett hadn't demanded agreement. She'd demanded honesty. And Romney, in that rare moment, gave it. It wasn't about sides. It was about standards. About remembering that power means nothing without principle. For a generation raised on cynicism, that single exchange was proof that integrity still has a pulse, and that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it nods. Pundits tried to turn it into strategy, but they missed the point. What people saw wasn't politics. It was humanity. Two voices, one young, fiery, and unshaken. The other seasoned, weary, but willing, meeting on the fragile bridge of truth. For Crockett, it was never about validation. She didn't need Romney's approval. What mattered was what it revealed, that even the old guard could recognize the strength in her fight. That decency, long buried under partisanship, could still break through the noise if someone dared to stand tall and speak plain. Across the country, something subtle shifted. In classrooms, debates, dinner tables, people replayed the clip, not for gossip, but for guidance. It reminded them what democracy is supposed to look like. Disagreement without dehumanization, conviction without cruelty. Respect isn't weakness. It's power, the kind that humbles arrogance, silences mockery, and rebuilds trust, one nod at a time. And maybe, just maybe, that's what this moment was about. Not a political win, but a moral one. A reminder that history doesn't always move with anger. Sometimes it moves with grace. Because when dignity stands unshaken and truth finds an unexpected ally, something far greater than politics takes shape, hope. And as the chamber lights dimmed, one truth lingered in the air. In a world where shouting gets you followers and truth gets you enemies, respect is rebellion. Mitt Romney didn't change sides that day. He didn't abandon his values. He simply did something Washington had forgotten how to do. He listened. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching that integrity still has a pulse. Jasmine Crockett didn't need validation. She earned respect. What happened in that chamber wasn't endorsement. It was acknowledgement. It was a quiet moment of truth cutting through the noise, proving that dignity can still win, even in the loudest room in America. When courage meets respect, something shifts. Walls crack. Minds open. Hope returns. So if you believe that decency still matters, if you believe courage deserves to be heard, don't let this moment fade. Like the video, share it. Leave your thoughts below. Because every click, every comment, every share keeps this conversation alive. It tells the world that dignity doesn't belong to a party. It belongs to us. Subscribe for more stories where truth stands tall, arrogance falls silent, and respect, real respect, takes center stage again.